November 14th, 1994. Authorities acting on an anonymous tip arrive at the home of a farmer, that of 37-year-old Timothy Allen Good. The tip received was from an unlikely source that police would not expect to receive information from. The source was from an individual who broke into the home looking for valuables to steal, but instead would find what was way more than what he was bargaining for. The caller would tell police to look in the basement. When police arrive on scene, they investigate the home, and when they go into the basement, they make a discovery that you would normally only expect out of a horror movie. In the basement, police describe the setting of the basement as a dungeon with bare walls and concrete floors. And in the dungeon was a bed where a decomposed body would be discovered to have been beaten and strangled, and as the investigation would tell, had been undisturbed for a year. Police would also describe that the upstairs floors of the home were lavishly furnished with large screen TVs, an expensive stereo system, and a jacuzzi. It was obvious that someone had lived there the entire time while there was a dead body in the basement, as the air vents were sealed to keep the odors from coming to the upper levels of the home. So now, you're asking yourself, who murders an individual and leaves them in the basement and then goes back upstairs with their family and live life normally as if nothing happened? Well, join me around the campfire tonight as we dive into this murder mystery. Welcome to the campfire. Grab your s'mores on the way to the logs or chairs. I am your host, Kevin. Thanks for joining me tonight around the campfire for our next tale in true crime. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast. And this is the case of Timothy Good. As mentioned in the intro, West Virginia State Trooper J.B. Armstrong described the room in the basement that the body would be found in as a dungeon, while someone was obviously living upstairs while the body was decomposing in the basement. The investigation would find that the body was that of Timothy Allen Good. So let's get into some of the background and see if we can find how a 37-year-old dairy farmer ended up dead in the basement of his own home. Timothy Allen Good, aka Tim as most Timothys go by, was born May 6, 1957 in York, Pennsylvania. Tim originally owned and operated a 350-acre dairy farm in Collinsville, Pennsylvania, which is a nice, quaint area, and it has a nice airport that I would frequently fly into. One of Tim's employees on his farm was a teenager that came from a broken home named Gene Kennedy. Tim would take a liking to Gene and become his unofficial guardian and teacher. And by 1987, Tim would hire a man named David Freeman, who proclaimed himself as a self-styled preacher. And within months of working for Tim, Gene and his wife, Eliza, would move into the main house along with Tim and Gene. Gene would recall that when he first came to live with Tim, instead of making it feel like he was just giving it to him, Tim taught him how to do stuff on the farm. Gene enjoyed his living situation, being able to be on his own and make money at the age of 13. It would become known that Tim was estranged from his family and often turned to Freeman for spiritual advice. Within a short, brief time, Freeman would begin acting as if he owned the farm. Gene claimed that he would often be locked out of the main house by Freeman, and every time Gene attempted to enter the house, he would be attacked by Freeman. Tim would intervene and remind Freeman that Gene lived there also and was allowed into the home. About a year after Freeman arrived, Tim stopped dairy farming. Gene would come down to the farm and find that there was no cows, calves, or dry stock. Everything would be empty. Tim would sell the farm for $1 million as he would tell his neighbor Rose, and then purchase a much smaller farm in West Virginia. Tim would seem particularly proud of acquiring $1 million for the farm. So, for those of you curious, $1 million in 1987 would be a little bit over $2.6 million in 2022. While Gene decided that he was going to stay in Pennsylvania, Freeman, who was now calling himself Dave, would move himself and his family with Tim to the new farm in West Virginia. It was reported that the plan was to build a church or religious commune on Tim's new property. According to Tim's family, he also began to express apocalyptic religious views, presumably due to Freeman. He would also become skeptical of the banking system and believe that the monetary system would fall apart. It wouldn't be long either before Freeman would start taking control of the farm as it appeared to neighbors on the outside looking in, as they described it as it appeared Freeman was the boss and Tim was the employee. Freeman would also use Tim's religion and beliefs against him to exploit him and make him his prisoner, confining Tim to the basement of the main house, which, if you have been keeping up, is Tim's house on Tim's farm that Freeman has essentially taken full control of at this point. Tim's neighbor, George Anderson, soon noticed that Tim was the one that was always doing the work while Freeman was always at the house. To George, it seemed like Freeman was the boss of the farm, not Tim. So, for example, Freeman would make Tim chop up the firewood for the house while he sat on the porch and supervised him. When George first met Tim, Tim would come to his house all of the time, every day. They would used to see and talk to each other, and they would usually talk about farming. Tim said that he was going to get his farm cleaned up and do a lot of work to it. But as time passed, Tim would visit George less and less. Eventually, sometime in 1993, stopped seeing each other at all. That's because now Dave would control when Tim would work and eat, if he would even be allowed to eat or drink anything at all. Freeman would often punish Tim by depriving him food and water whenever he made a mistake by telling him it wasn't God's way of doing things. All the while, Dave and his family lived lavishly upstairs, enjoying the food and luxuries such as the hot tub that has all been purchased with Tim's money. In August of 1993, Tim's father and stepmother surprised Tim with a visit at his home. They noticed that he did not want them to come inside. He claimed that the house was being fixed up. That would be the last time they would see Tim. Freeman would also refuse to let people inside the home. It would become apparent that he also didn't want people to see him on the property. Before too long, both Freeman and Tim would seem to just disappear from sight. The last time that Tim would be seen alive would be in November of 1993, when he would purchase a handgun from Walmart. George would report that he didn't see Tim or Freeman for about a year and would assume that they had just left the area. In October of 1994, almost a year after the last time Tim was seen, George's grandchildren noticed a taxi heading towards Tim's house. However, it was stopped by a tree that had fallen across the driveway. The kids would tell George that the Freemans were back. At that point, George would approach Freeman and ask about Tim's whereabouts. But he would just tell George that he didn't know where Tim was and that he hadn't seen him for a while. It was presumed that Freeman returned to Tim's home to retrieve the diaries that he often wrote in. However, whenever he was stopped by George and the grandchildren, that he had the notion he wouldn't be able to remove anything from the home without being noticed. Then George's son-in-law reported giving Freeman and his family a ride to Washington, D.C. and dropping them off at a service station. This would be the last time that Freeman would be seen. After they left the area, George would go up to the home and notice that the kitchen door was broken. He would go inside, but wouldn't go any further than the kitchen. A few weeks after the Freemans left and were dropped off in D.C., a home invader looking for valuables to steal breaks into Tim's home and discovers way more than what he was ready for. He finds Tim's decomposing body in the basement, and with no evidence of Freeman still living there, the intruder contacts authorities and tells them to look in the basement. Forensics would determine that Tim was strangled and left in the basement, presumably after an altercation when confronting Freeman. It was speculated that the Freemans lived upstairs while Tim's body was decomposing with the sealed air vents to keep odors from fuming upstairs. It was also speculated that the Freemans left when they ran out of Tim's money. While police were searching the home, they discovered volumes of diaries from David Freeman. They found in these diaries were tales of how Freeman would talk about manipulating Tim and ultimately killing him. This would give authorities the evidence for making Freeman their only suspect as a warrant for his arrest, but there was just one problem. No one knew where Freeman was. Alright guys, so now we're going to take a short break and replenish our s'mores for the next part of this episode. Alright guys, and we're back. As investigators kept reading into the diaries, they found that Freeman took advantage and preyed on Tim's religious beliefs and would preach to him daily and give Tim messages that he would claim were from God. Tim believed that his only way to God was through Freeman. Authorities would find in Freeman's diaries that they revealed while he and his family lived comfortably upstairs, Tim would become a virtual prisoner in the basement. According to the diaries, Freeman locked him in the basement each night. He was only allowed to leave the property to run errands for Freeman. Police believe that Freeman exploited Tim's religious beliefs to take over his home. Investigators would find grocery receipts that indicated that the Freemans had lived in the house for approximately 7 months after Tim's death. They apparently left when they ran out of money. Tim's bank account, which had previously held $1 million, now contained less than $2. Authorities believe that Tim was murdered sometime between November of '93 and March of '94. Freeman indicated in the diaries that Tim questioned him about the money. Freeman apparently realized that he did not have the control on Tim that he had once had. It was believed that Tim was starting to plan to retake control of his life and property from Freeman. This was probably why he purchased the handgun before he disappeared, presumably murdered. State Trooper Armstrong believes that this was what caused Tim's demise because Freeman thought that if he was losing control of Tim, that he would have to kill him. On February 15th, 1996, Freeman was officially wanted for the murder of Tim Good, although still on the loose and his whereabouts being unknown. He would evade police for 3 more months until authorities would track him down in Sterling, Virginia. Unsolved Mysteries aired an episode about Tim Good and the suspect wanted for his murder, David Freeman. West Virginia State Trooper Armstrong flew to the call center for Unsolved Mysteries to monitor the calls, and a viewer of the show called in the tip recognizing Freeman as 39-year-old William David Cooper, who was using the alias and working as an auto mechanic. The tipster stated that Freeman recently worked on his car and made an unforgettable impression, as Freeman ripped him off, charging the viewer $1,000 more than what he was supposed to pay. The viewer didn't just stop there. He had Freeman's address where he was living and provided that as well. Within hours, police had Freeman's apartment staked out in Sterling, Virginia. In the early hours of May 18, 1996, Freeman would walk outside of his apartment, and after confirming his description, they would wait until Freeman left, as his wife and 4 kids were also in the apartment. As Freeman would leave at 9:15 a.m., police pulled him over, where they would make the arrest and charge him with the murder of Timothy Allen Good. When they arrested Freeman, they would find that he would also be in possession of Tim's firearm. When Freeman was arrested, his first reply was, "Oh, they found the body." It would also be believed that David Freeman wasn't actually David Freeman, according to authorities. Authorities believed his real name to be either William Cooper or could also be Winston George Jelks. Winston George Jelks was also another alias that Freeman would use. After his arrest, his wife, Arlene Elizabeth Whitehurst, aka Eliza Cooper, would also be wanted and would elude authorities until her arrest in 1997. Although indicted on felony counts of murder and conspiracy, it was unclear if she was ever charged and found guilty of those indictments. According to Freeman's diary, authorities believe that Tim wasn't Cooper's first or only murder. They believed that he was also responsible for multiple murders, including that of 2 of his own children from a previous marriage. Police would also note that Cooper believed that the end of the world was near and that he was associated previously with a cult, as he had many ties and contacts in the Baltimore and Washington, D.C. area. In October of 1997, Cooper would plead guilty to voluntary manslaughter and sentenced to 10 years in prison. After his release, there isn't a lot to mention about him, except that he would later die in 2018. So you may be wondering, as many others had, why wasn't he charged with first-degree murder? A lot of responses to that notion was perhaps there wasn't enough evidence to get the first-degree murder conviction or any murder conviction. Speculation is that prosecutors wanted to charge him with what evidence they had available to them so that he would be convicted and not set free. So that concludes this tale at the campfire. I know this episode was a little bit shorter than usual. However, I was limited to the information or lack of information that there was about this story. All resources used to gather information for the case include, but not limited to, news articles, reports, documentaries, as well as other sources. I appreciate everyone who has gathered by the campfire with me for this case. Also, if you'd like to listen to ad-free shows as well as bonus episodes and get a shout out on the podcast during the most recent episode, then sign up and join me over at the Bonfire. You can find the Bonfire over on Patreon, where there are also different tiers you can choose from. And as the podcast will grow, so will the tiers, and more tiers will be added. I appreciate all the support from all the listeners and supporters. Also, if you wish to support the show but not necessarily sign up for a subscription, you can also support the show through the Campfire's PayPal. A link to the PayPal will be in the show notes. Join me next time on Christmas Eve as we gather around the campfire for the next grisly tale for our Christmas episode. This is the Campfire Crime Chronicles, a true crime podcast.